Hello, welcome all. First of all, I'd like to welcome you in this interactive session focused on water resilience assessment framework. With this session, we are launching our flagship product, that's water resilience assessment framework that we have been developing for the last 1 year, 1.5 years. The agenda for the session is broadly divided into 3 sections. Firstly, briefly, we describe the framework, what it is, how it looks like, what are the audience, what is the scope, what are the audience, how you apply it in very short 10 minutes presentation, and followed by 15 to 20 minutes of reflection from expert group of panelists who are joining us today. And finally, we'll have about 25 minutes for question and answer. You can use the chat function to ask the question to the panelists, the chat function in the path tables. The chat function in Zoom window is disabled for all the participants. The session will be wrapped up by synthesizing the panel discussion by the moderator of the panel discussion, and it will be closed with next steps and thank you note by Jason Morrison. I think it's very short and clear agenda today. We would like you to ask questions, as many as you like, using the chat function. The speaker would also be joining the panel discussion, so you can also hold your questions to the speaker who is presenting the RAP framework, and she can respond to your question during that Q&A session. That's the agenda. There are 3 survey questions which is now open to everyone. You can answer these questions. The first question is about why resilience, and the second question is about the practicality of the framework, and third question is about what next. So you can answer them in your own time as you feel comfortable. With that, I will pass the session to Kari Davis from AGWA. She is going to present the framework itself. Kari, over to you.
Great. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending where you are in the world. My name is Kari Davis, and I'm the Technical Director at the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. As Ashok said, over the past year, we have closely worked together to develop the Water Resilience Assessment Framework, which we will present to you now. The project started in 2019, and the milestone publication is being launched today. I encourage you to go download it from the link, which I believe will be put in the chat. I'll now briefly provide an overview of our thinking in the framework. More information can be found in the publication, which will be linked in the chat. As I go through the framework, please write any questions that arise in the Pathable chat window, not the Zoom chat window, and we'll address them later in the session. Our world is changing. The effects of climate change, population growth, other anthropogenic impacts, and extreme events can impact our water resources in known and unknown ways. These changes can be gradual or sudden and can often yield irreversible shifts in the system. A linear approach is insufficient to meet such evolving targets. Often enhancing efficiency by maximizing the output per unit of input produces brittle solutions. A brittle solution is not a resilient solution and can fail under shocks and stresses. As such, organizations need to think about how they can build resilience in a changing system. They need to take a step back and look at the entire system they operate in and are dependent on. In this case, a system is not just a river basin or supply chain, but a set of interconnected socioeconomic, institutional, governance, infrastructure, management, and biophysical components that function as a whole. An evaluation of the system components and anticipated changes will allow organizations to better identify challenges and opportunities and act upon them. The Water Resilience Assessment Framework, or WRAF, emerged from the need to help organizations such as corporates, utilities, urban planners, and basin authorities build resilience. Overall, our aim is to stop shocks and stresses from becoming crises and allow organizations to survive and thrive despite shifting conditions. The WRAF is a high-level framework that can be adapted and applied to any specific stakeholder or sectoral perspective. It is deliberately designed to not be overly prescriptive, allowing opportunities for context-specific inquiry. It is an invitation for stakeholders within a water system to explore the boundaries of these insights, strengthen system-wide understanding, and collaborate to build resilience. The RAF is composed of 4 steps, moving from left to right and then circling back. It describes a set of logical steps in determining system components and boundaries, step 1, selecting and developing resilient strategies and implementable resilient actions, step 2, and testing the impacts of these actions to enhance the resilience of the system, step 3. Finally, the framework provides a means to evaluate, and if needed, revise choices taken during the previous steps, which is step 4. It is meant to be an iterative process that can be revised and revisited. Stakeholder engagement can be included in all steps of the RAF based on the organization and system needs. Special effort should be made to engage with the stakeholders who have the most impact on the water system and the water users most reliant on these resources, as well as vulnerable and frequently overlooked communities. I'm now going to dive a bit into the first 3 steps of the framework and discuss some key considerations in each step. If you'd like more information, please see our recent publication. The first step of the RAF invites you to see the system in which your organization operates. By system here, we do not just mean a river basin, but a set of interconnected components such as infrastructure, policy, or economic aspects that can be changed over time. As such, the boundaries of your system may also change over time, and continual monitoring and evaluation is essential to capture those system components and changes. Once the system boundary is established and the key components are identified, you can then develop a better understanding of the water status and trends in the system, or in other words, the past, present, and predicted future water conditions and flows. This can be done using quantitative or qualitative modeling approaches. Finally, significant drivers, shocks, and stresses need to be determined that would impact the level of services available from the system. It is important to identify the types of changes we are facing and how these changes affect critical system processes. Shocks and stresses can cause short-term disruptions, gradual shifts, or sudden radical changes. Understanding how the system is changing or how it is anticipated to change will inform the resilience strategy selected. Resilience assumes that conditions impacting the functioning of a system are always changing. Step 2 moves from assessing the system changes to developing a strategy to address them. A resilience strategy is a systematic approach to understanding and addressing drivers, shocks, and stresses. Different strategies might be appropriate for different components of a system. Individual stakeholders might also adapt different strategies based on their needs or impacts. There are 3 types of strategies: persistence, adaptation, and transformation. Persistence is about the functions and processes of a system continuing unchanged or with only a brief interruption. Success under a persistent strategy looks like returning to a pre-shock condition as quickly as possible. Adaptation assumes that tomorrow will be different than today. Most of the changes are gradual and predictable. Successful adaptation means tracking change over time and taking the necessary actions to address current and anticipated changes. Transformation is the result of a fundamental shift in a system or a significant change in the needs of the system. A transformation strategy typically requires reconsidering fundamental aspects of an organization and its relationships and operations. Following strategy selection, resilience characteristics allow you to select aspects such as robustness or flexibility to prioritize in formulating resilience actions or interventions. The subsequent indicators for each action will be used in the next step to test the ability of the actions to build system resilience. Stress testing is a well-established process for considering how a system, institution, or sector may perform under adverse conditions. For the RAF, stress testing helps to determine the relative impact and utility of resilience actions under a range of plausible future scenarios. The impact of these actions are measured by the resilience indicators. The stress test clarifies how well the actions respond to shocks and stresses, as well as how effectively they support the goals of the selected resilience strategy. The stress test can also be used to compare and evaluate different actions to determine which produce the most effective results. The RAF is not intended to replace your existing water management practices and approaches, but to supplement them. The RAF adds an overlay of resilience to traditional water accounting and water stewardship techniques and provides an on-ramp to more complex water and climate resilience processes. The RAF does not make existing practices obsolete, but instead adds additional capacities and linkages. While not included here, the RAF also supports public policy aims beneath the UN Sustainable Development Goals and offers a way to pursue these goals throughout a process that also supports water system resilience. The framework that was just introduced to you is a result of multiple years of collaboration. However, there's more work to be done. The next steps focus on three main areas: engagement, guidance, and piloting. The general framework is an invitation for collaboration. We invite you to engage with the framework and explore the boundaries of these insights. We want to start a dialogue so that we can learn from each other and map the emerging issues for our economies, communities, and ecosystems. To support implementation of the framework, we're in the process of developing the first set of sector-specific guidance documents for corporates, utilities, urban planners, and basin authorities. This is also an invitation to collaborate and think about these ideas in the context of your organization. We are also developing a library of cases. Finally, we are beginning to explore partnerships for piloting the RAF. Let us know if your organization would like to lead the way. I would like to close this section by highlighting the importance of collaboration for building resilience. This framework was developed collaboratively, and further exploring and implementing it will also take us all working together. I encourage you to download our recent publication and give it a read. There's much more information in there than what I could cover in this brief presentation. Following this panel discussion, there will also be an opportunity to ask questions. As you think of questions, please enter those questions in the Pathable chat, and we will address them at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Excellent, very well kept time management. I will pass over to John Matthews to introduce the panel and to lead the panel discussion. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Ashok, and thank you so much, Kari Davis. I'm the Executive Director for AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. We've been a really proud partner with the other organizations led by Pacific Institute, World Resources Institute, EME, and others in this process, and we're really grateful to be here. The way the next bit is going to occur, we're going to have four panelists. They were not involved in the development of RAF. They've had a chance to look at the document. We're going to talk about some of the issues relating to resilience, to their work across a variety of different sectors. Then we're going to turn to you, the audience, for your questions, for your comments and reflections. Where are you with the resilience pathway, the resilience journey? I'd like to begin with asking Jed Youngs. He's with BHP. He's speaking to us from Australia. He's the practice lead for water stewardship at BHP. And I'm wondering, Jed, if you could turn on your camera, please. Thanks. Could you talk a little bit about why, maybe for folks who aren't familiar with BHP, the kind of nature of your business, and before talking a little bit about why resilience, especially water resilience, has become an important issue for BHP?
Thanks, John. Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the RAF. And hello, everybody from Perth in Western Australia. So for those who aren't familiar with BHP, it's a large mining company, very large mining company, and we've got operations all around the world. And as is the nature of a business like ours, as a resource company, those operations are quite dependent on water and managing water well. And we also have quite a large water footprint. So for us, it makes a lot of sense to understand water very well and make sure that it's being managed responsibly.
Excellent. I'm curious why, in your reading of RAF, do you feel like it is presenting insights that are relevant, that are useful? Are there some key ideas that have struck you as potentially relevant to the water embedded in your operations?
Yeah, you know, John, I might actually perhaps reflect a little bit on the start of the RAF and you know, how the initial sort of conception of it, because you know, it did start, as you've mentioned, a couple of years ago, and it really came about from conversations between a number of people, some of them within BHP, but a lot of the people who've ended up writing the report, who were really trying to understand the challenges around water stewardship and some of the barriers. And I think one of the biggest challenges that was recognised, which is certainly something that we continue to see, is that the lack of a common language for water, and something that sort of helps you regardless of where you are or what your activities are, helps everybody to describe all their effects in a common way so that we can manage them together. So that's why it began, as I think you mentioned, as a common water accounting framework. But what I think is quite interesting is that as the team worked on it, they came to realise that there might be a better way to achieve this common language and create a stronger management tool, because it's really about more than just getting the metrics right. You also need to have the context. And I think that's the part that we find really attractive about this, is that it's a way to help you take the context and help you understand the stresses in that system, and bring them together in a way that lets us compare and contrast all of the things that are happening in the catchment. So ultimately we can find a way to manage it in a collective way.
That's super. And thank you very much for that. We'll come back to you, Jed, in a minute. Next, I'd really like to turn to Stephanie Woodward. If you could turn on your camera and microphone as well, Stephanie. She's the program manager for water and climate at Facebook. And it's first off, I'm just really impressed that Facebook has a water and climate program, and maybe you could talk a little bit about why a group that most of us think is something that we're relating to on our phone it actually is thinking about water resilience and in terms of your corporate identity.
Sure, definitely. I think, like you said, we think of Facebook as this digital platform on our phones, but all of those likes and cat videos live somewhere, and that's in our data centers, which require water and energy to operate 24/7, and need to be resilient to shocks to the system, both within our own operations and in our communities as well.
I think it's really important that our cat videos all be very resilient. But you're also talking about the kind of back end operations too that are important. Do you think about issues, say, around supply chain, or are those critical too?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been working with our suppliers to conduct climate resilience risk assessments for the last several years, using models to project potential risk scenarios and how those might impact not only our operations, but our suppliers as well.
And in your reading of RAF so far, I know you're still new to it. Were there insights or observations that seem like they might help bridge towards new perspectives for you in your work?
Yeah, I think that the framework is really valuable, not only for us sort of in the sustainability HQ seat, but for folks in our data centers and global security in our facilities, to really provide a framework for thinking about a lot of these really challenging questions. I also love that this work is adaptable and able to recognize that resilience looks different in different contexts, and is also iterative, and that stress testing the strategies is kind of built into the document and the framework itself, recognizing that with climate change and other stresses, the context will continue to evolve. This isn't something that we'll do once and be done with, but something that we'll have to continue doing over time as a practice.
I'm so glad that there's also a water resilience lifestyle that you're promoting.
Exactly. Yes.
I'm going to turn now to Eliza Roberts at WSP. We'll come back to you in a bit, Stephanie. And Eliza is the project director at WSP. Maybe you could also just start off by, with folks who may not be familiar with WSP, talk a little bit about the nature of the business and your work in particular. Thanks.
Great, thanks, John.
So hi, everybody. Really great to connect with you all, although I wish it was in person in Stockholm. So as John noted, my name is Eliza Roberts, and I'm the water lead for the Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change team, which is part of WSP's climate, resilience, and sustainability business. We partner with clients to provide a range of different services from inventory management and risk assessments to goal setting and strategy. We have a water service offering. We also have a climate risk and resilience service offering. And we're seeing increasing interest from clients on both fronts.
That's really interesting. So you have almost a kind of meta view, actually, of a lot of different types of institutions, especially businesses. And is water risk, maybe water opportunities too? Is it something that is coming up, or something that you feel like you're introducing them to as an idea?
Yeah, we were definitely seeing a lot more interest from clients on water specifically, goal setting, strategy development, how to increasingly recently, especially how to bake resilience into that. There are other clients where we've been working with them for a long time, and we're on the inventory risk assessment process, and we're introducing them to new concepts and things that they really need to think about beyond just being more efficient, but truly changing the way that they manage water across their value chain.
Very interesting. So one of the big ideas that I heard Kari talk about is this idea of trying to see water as a system, not just to say as a basin, but maybe that's embedded in a lot of our operations. Is that part of what you're doing with the inventory management?
Yeah, as a part of inventory management and a lot of other services. Sometimes if it's just inventory management, not quite as much. But I can give you some examples of some of the types of work that we've done with clients. So we're working with a Fortune 500 IT company to evaluate the resilience of their data centers. We're working with water utilities to assess climate resilience. And in many cases, they're actually doing a lot already, but they're not necessarily putting it looking at it under the lens of resilience. They're calling it something else, which is really interesting. We're also working with clients to tackle water challenges in their supply chain. Trying to really bring their suppliers along, so they're not just looking within their four walls, but looking beyond that.
Was there something specific in RAF touching on those issues that jumped out at you when you were reading through the document?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there that's really great. And for those who haven't had a chance to dive in yet, I encourage you to. There's a lot of really great lines in there. And one thing that I really appreciated was the emphasis on transformation. I think, I've been in the water space for about a decade. I'm sure many of you have been in the water space that long or longer. And, when I first started, the big focus was drip irrigation, efficiency, and that's the answer. And it's so important to go beyond that. And so many companies haven't quite gotten there yet. And so, if we think about all the different ways that the water sector needs to transform, from water utilities increasing access to reclaimed water, which more and more companies are requesting from their utilities, to more zero water facilities, where you're using water from dairy that's processed, to more policy engagement to really change systems so that we can really collectively work to solve these challenges. One company alone just can't do all of that by themselves. And I think one other just key example that I think about all the time, I feel like someday my kids are going to ask me, Mom, did you really flush pure drinking water down the toilet? And that is our reality, that water is just not managed well in this country and in many countries across the globe. And we have such a long way to go to transform that and fix that.
Great answers. Thanks. And we'll come back to you too, Eliza. I'd now like to turn to Alexis Dufour. He's at San Francisco Public Utility Commission, SFPUC, and a program manager for long-term vulnerability. Welcome, Alexis. Could you talk maybe just a little bit about your work, long-term vulnerability? I understand from before that's not your emotional vulnerability.
Thank you, John. Thank you for this joke. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. Just San Francisco Public Utilities Commission serves water to 2.7 million people in the San Francisco Bay Area in California, in the United States. We also have a service for sewer collection within the city of San Francisco, and we provide also clean power to the citizens of San Francisco. So why this resilience is important for us is in infrastructure development, like we are in water systems, we think about long life cycles of infrastructure. And so we need to think about what will happen in the future to this infrastructure. And that actually means that we need to think about, well, how resilient this infrastructure will be to very uncertain conditions. So for us at SFPUC currently, we're trying to change our approach to planning, which was more based on a traditional approach of let's predict and let's try to have a crystal ball and see what will happen, and let's try to optimize our system to a specific condition. And now we have more, we're trying to move towards an approach that's more in line with what you're proposing in your framework, which is let's think about our system first, and like let's clearly define the boundaries of our system, and let's try to find the vulnerabilities of our system, and from there understand how can we build it so it's more resilient.
That's really interesting. I mean, you're also a conjoined utility too. It's water and power. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So do you see resilience trade-offs between generating electricity and supplying water? Is that something that you all try to manage as well?
Yes, that's a very interesting point. And up to a certain point we are, and we definitely see some synergies between the two, and particularly in crises. For example, in a long drought in California, where we need to preserve water, meaning if we need to conserve water in a reservoir, that means that we have less hydro power production, which means that we need to go to the market to purchase power. But because there's less power being produced by hydro, it means that there's an increase in cost in natural gas. And so the cost of power on the market is higher. So from a financial standpoint, there's actually some resilience we need to think about resilience as well. But San Francisco is a water first policy utility. So first of all, we're here to provide drinking water to 2.7 million people.
Maybe one last question. We've heard from a wide variety of types of institutions already, just among the previous three panelists. And I'm curious, what is long term for SFPUC? Is that 50 years? Is it 100 years?
That's a very good question. We, as we're planning, typically planning in California is on a 10-year up to maybe a 20-year window. Now we're trying to extend this at SFPUC and looking at a 50-year window. Mainly this is important so that we can really include the climate change within as a signal to see how we need to design our utilities and our facilities. However, it becomes difficult to communicate with stakeholders when you think so far in the future. And so it's difficult to go beyond 20 or even like when we get to 50 years and start talking about demand, for example, and what will population growth will do and what will regulation do. So we're expanding the envelope using scenarios, a wide range of possibilities of plausible futures, but also being conscious that the communication aspect of this is challenging.
Very interesting. If I could invite all of the panelists to turn on your screens, your cameras, and I'd really like to invite all of you now to be able to ask questions. I noticed that there's already a question that's come through to Stephanie as well. That's looking about some of the water that's embedded in your operations. Would you maybe like to start off with your answer more generally, Stephanie?
Sure, happy to talk about that. The question, for those who haven't seen it, was around what we're doing to minimize our operational water footprint. Efficiency is at the core of our data center designs, and they're designed to be 80% more efficient than the industry standard. And in addition, we're always running pilot tests and experiments to see if we can push that efficiency even further. In addition to what we're doing operationally within our data centers, we're also restoring water in starting in high-risk basins with the goal of being water positive by 2030.
Very interesting. If I could ask Kari for you to turn on your camera as well. We need your expertise as a contributor and content expert too with RAF. We'd really welcome all questions about RAF as well, not just for the specific panelists. Maybe one question I'd like to toss out first to you, Eliza, is I'm curious how well you spoke specifically about the issue of transformation as a real challenge that we face right now. Were there could you maybe talk about a specific case where transformation is something that you're working, say, with a client to be able to try and manage? I think transformation is one of those topics. It's really hard for a lot of people to be able to picture, even if in many places, in many parts of the world, that we're well along that process. Oh, if you could unmute, sorry.
Great. Thank you. So one example that I can speak to is some of the work that we've been doing with a client and this speaks to the water energy nexus that Alexa, you were asking Alexis about, is helping clients look not just about the water that they're using within their own four walls or even within their supply chain, but to look at the water embedded in purchased electricity. So there's a methodology that was developed by some of my colleagues, also with the World Resources Institute. So we've been using that to help client identify how they need to maybe change what their informed decision-making, both on the climate side and on the water side, and make sure that if they have a climate goal, how can they make decisions that don't have unintended consequences for water? So I'll stop there, but that's one example for you.
It's a good answer. I was also really struck by some of the news just yesterday coming out of California that some of the major reservoirs that feed the energy systems, the energy grid, have fallen below turbine generation levels, and the state is actually bringing temporary gas-fired energy systems just to be able to compensate and avoid load shedding. That's a remarkable development, and of course with really perverse consequences. I mean, it's a really good example of those kinds of system level effects that are going across a wide region, and something that are probably in the edge of transformation too. We have a question, maybe for Jed and Kari, as two people who are more familiar with RAF, about in looking through it, did you have a sense about how long that process might take, and maybe comparing like maybe a more qualitative approach versus a more quantitative approach? Maybe first with you, Jed.
Thanks, John. You may get a more educated answer from Kari on this one, but I mean, my first sense is that it's the RAF is an attempt to wrap its arms around an essentially complex situation. So it's not, you wouldn't expect it to be a fast process. I mean, if I think of it as a way of pulling together the information that we have and making sure we've understood the values of an area, and then helping to turn that into decisions, I think it's a process that honestly you should expect to take years. It's certainly not something that you could do in months. How many years? I'm not sure exactly, and I think it'll vary from place to place on the complexity of the natural system and I guess how aligned the stakeholders initially are as well, because I think there is a process of bringing people together to a common understanding.
And there, I think you're talking about kind of mainstreaming at a much larger level throughout the organization. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about what I think the convening power perhaps that the RAF can have, which is that if it's if it takes the journey that we hope it will, wouldn't be something necessarily that's driven by one single organisation. It will be by the stakeholders in the catchment, and you want everybody thinking in the same way about that. So it takes some time to work your way through that. But I think it's a framework that can help with that, which is a necessary journey we have to go on anyway.
That makes a lot of sense. And maybe Kari, I think a lot of what Jed is saying there too is if you're going really deep into thinking about resilience at a larger scale, at that system level, you're probably engaging with a lot of stakeholders. But is that necessarily always the case? Would that be a major modifier in how you're applying RAF?
Yeah, I think it can be. One thing, the way we design RAF is you can choose what stakeholders you engage with, recognizing that not all organizations have the capacity to engage with all stakeholders. Going back to the timing question of this too, I think there's kind of two levels. So resilience is a process, and I think you can start that process of building resilience rather quickly, but continuing to build it, engaging with the RAF can require years. And I think it is an ongoing process as well. The idea of RAF is also to continue to revisit it as conditions change and to test the ability of your strategy to build resilience. So it will require that iterative process and returning to it multiple times.
That's a great answer. And maybe Stephanie, one of the things I've been kind of struck by as I've been working on RAF is that often the way we've talked about sustainability is in specific numeric targets, that they're kind of fixed for us. But I think a lot of what Kari's saying too is that resilience is not just fixed numbers, it's also something that we need to actually be sensitive to changing context, changing baselines. Is that something that you've seen in your work as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And in our climate resilience program, it's something that we revisit year after year with our internal stakeholders and with suppliers, knowing that conditions are constantly changing.
That's really really good to hear. And Alexis, one of the other things that I'm aware from the rest of my work about SFPUC is you also provision water for a lot of other cities, a lot of other entities in California. You're a bulk water supplier, and does that mean that when you're thinking about resilience, that you need to bring those kinds of groups along as well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's true. We supply water to the city of San Francisco, but we wholesale water to 27 customers around the San Francisco Bay, so municipalities mainly. And it's important what Carrie said when you say choosing your stakeholders, depending on where you are in your process, because it's very important to get as much input as you can, but sometimes it can also slow down your process. And so when we think about initially at San Francisco, when we thought about establishing our vulnerabilities from our system as we know it, we tried to limit the stakeholders to our internal experts. However, now that we're trying to move towards adaptation and actions and like looking for alternative water supply, there's a program at SFPUC on alternative water supply. We need to engage with our community and with these customers. And a lot of these programs or projects are going to be in partnership with other customers that we have. And that's when we have to bring them in to find solution. That at least that's at this point, it's been our process.
Yeah,
we definitely have to also engage with the stakeholders that we are engaging continuously with is the environmental community, because we're taking most of our water from one main river, the Tuolumne River in California, and it's a very iconic river. And so we need to continuing stay engaged with this environmental community to make sure that we find a solution that's acceptable for everyone.
That's a great answer. I have another question for Stephanie from Tatiana. What kind of water assessment is Facebook doing before choosing locations to build units? And do you focus on quantity issues? Do you focus on other requirements?
Yeah, great question. Water is one of many factors that we look at when deciding where to site a data center, but it is certainly an important one. And we look at things like reliability of supply. We work really closely with the local utility. We do sort of a stakeholder assessment to understand, other important actors in the watershed, and look at, quality of water, of course, as well.
Excellent. I have a question for Jed, and then I think one for Kari after that. This is from Derek, a colleague. Following on Jed's response about a multi-year process to apply RAF, how likely are companies to exhibit the patience and leadership to see this through place by place, or are companies expected to apply it at a higher level, considering their value chain as a system? Maybe part of what Derek's also asking is BHP more unique, or is it more typical of where you see companies headed?
Yeah, that's a very, very fair question. I think the comment about applying it at the value chain is an interesting one. And to be honest, I hadn't actually thought of it in that sense. But given that it has a systems approach, it might work in that way. But I do think that, not only BHP, but a lot of companies are quite committed to long-term approaches on these things. And as an example, at the moment, we're working through a piece of work called we're working through our water resource assessments at the moment, where we're looking at a bunch of different areas across the globe and trying to understand the shared values and the shared challenges in those areas. And I think similar to the comment that Stephanie made earlier, it's a process that we'll go back and revisit from time to time. So I think you see that sort of commitment from companies actually quite becoming more and more often. And I also think it's actually something that's quite necessary if we're talking about a management framework, is that you have to have that commitment to work with it for a number of years.
Very interesting. I'm going to go to Kari, and then I have a question for Eliza after that about indicators. And Kari, there's a question from Hella that is asking about are there specific parts of the landscape that RAF maybe is more focused? We mentioned cities, and we have Alexis here, and Eliza's also mentioned like her work with utilities. Is this more specific to in cities to utilities, or maybe urban resilience more generally? And is it something that might play out differently in more rural landscapes or less densely populated areas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way we designed the RAF was that it could be applied to many different situations and sectors. So in that regard, it's applicable to all the things that were mentioned here. That being said, we are going to focus on 3 different areas to develop further sector-specific guidance. The first being utilities in the urban sector, the second being basin management, so more of this policy side, and then the third being corporates. That's not to say that those are the only ones that could apply it. I'm sure all stakeholders could find some value in it. Also, it isn't just specific to different sizes of organizations. Definitely all sizes could apply it, small, medium, and large. And then their capacity to apply it and engage with the framework would then determine what aspects they take and they apply. One thing too that's really key to this framework is that it recognizes that not all stakeholders have the same power to implement basin-wide or system-wide solutions. So it's up to the stakeholders to really determine what they have the capacity to do and can change in their system.
Excellent. And maybe Eliza, like following up on the question that I asked Stephanie before about this contrast between sustainability and resilience, we still need to be able to show progress, right? And you probably, when you're talking to your clients, you need to be able to show that you've made solid and clear recommendations, that you've made a difference, that maybe resilience is something that you can count and track. And there are lots of frameworks and approaches, they're kind of proposed indicators that are out there. This is based on a question from Amy. I'm curious that do you see that that RAF is something that might be able to help develop indicators of resilience to help tell us if we're moving towards it or away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a big opportunity for that. And I don't know if that's something you guys are planning on including in the sector guidance, but obviously indicators like that are going to be much more helpful for companies when they are sector specific. But I think another thing to add to this is when we are talking to clients, we've often found that really meeting them where they are and finding out what they've already done and then educating them and saying, oh, that actually is resilience. Like you're already doing that is a really great way to get the conversation going. And John, can I ask you a question? You and Carrie?
Please. Yeah, please.
You guys said we could ask you questions. So now you guys are in the spotlight. One thing that I was thinking about when reviewing this is the focus on equity and inclusion. And I know that is included in RAF and you guys do speak to it. I do think it could be a bit more prominent. And I'm just curious if you guys can speak to that a little bit. I think people is such an important part of water management today. There are no businesses that can operate without water. There are no people who can live without water. It's a human right. You guys all know this. But if you guys could just speak to that, I think that would be really helpful.
Sure, I'll jump in, and Akari, if you want to add anything to it, and Jason will come in a few minutes too, and he may want to say something on that topic as well. But I've been working on climate impacts since 2003 and on climate adaptation since 2007, and I've really only heard discussions that are really meaningful and substantive about equity in climate change, especially kind of resilient poverty alleviation, resilient representation in the past couple of years. I think it's still pretty new. The climate justice discussion, I think, is still pretty fresh. I'm sure that you're right that we need to bring it in more. I mean, I think it also goes to what feels like a kind of thread in this discussion about how do we view resilience as something that's just for our institution, or do we have is resilience something that belongs to a larger group, and that when we bring other people along, that it actually makes us more resilient too. I think that's probably if I could take away from Jed's comments, what he's are really trying to get to, that is like thinking of resilience as a multi-year process, that if the communities and all of the communities where we're working are not resilient, then we're not doing enough, and somehow we have to be able to bring those groups together. I think it's a real challenge being able to hear those voices sometimes. But I think it's also incumbent on us to think of big resilience and not just kind of personal, institutional, highly localized resilience. Do you want to add anything to that, Kari?
Yeah, just briefly. And John, that was a good response. But I think what's important here too is that I agree that yes, that equity and inclusion needs to be very much included throughout this process, not just in specific steps. And one way that can be is just from the beginning, and when you define the problem and what stresses and shocks are significant, look at who's impacted and make sure that everyone's captured in that part too. Ultimately, those that are vulnerable are going to be the most impacted by climate change. And it's really important to think about how, when, and where that's going to happen.
Yeah, very, very interesting. There's a question. I think it was maybe it's more of a comment that was more aimed at Jed, but I'd actually welcome kind of a broader response too. It's from Michael. I think one of the problems is that water management hasn't been aware of issues. Oh, sorry. No, it's directed towards Stephanie. I apologize. And also from Michael. Pepsi said that they'll move out of an area where they are causing problems without where they're taking out too much water. And I wonder. I mean, that in a sense, that's kind of a strategic issue, right? Like saying that our footprint in one place is just too big, and maybe what we need to do is we need to think about not just kind of incremental resilience, like how do we adjust to minor shifts, but actually say, we need to do this work somewhere else, or we need to do a different kind of work. And that's kind of an intriguing point. Is that something that's come up in your work, Stephanie or Jed?
Well, thankfully, no, not yet. It hasn't come to that point. I think, you know, a lot of our operations are really, you know, significant pieces of infrastructure that are built to last 20 or 30 years. So in siting, we are really careful about where we go and what types of water resources are available and what kind of water stress the basin is facing, and not only do everything we can within our own operations to maximize efficiency, but also are committed to being a long-term partner in water stewardship and collective action in the basin. So working with trusted nonprofits to restore water, addressing water access where that is an issue as well. So we're, you know, committed to being a part of the solution.
Excellent. Jed, did you want to add anything? It's also fine to say no.
No, I certainly will add. I mean, I think you know, similarly, the sorts of mines that we operate are there for the long term, and so it's actually one of the reasons why water stewardship is so important to us, is because we're typically in those areas for 100 years plus, and so, you know, we've got a very strong interest in making sure that those areas are sustainable for everybody. I think one of the interesting things that happens though is that once you're in an area and the norms change over time, as they do, then what was acceptable some time ago may not be acceptable anymore. And, you know, I think the approach we have to take is that if you're there when those norms change, then you need to try to adapt and move to those new norms and recognize what good looks like now. So we certainly try to do that.
Yeah, it's not just the climate that's non-stationary, right? It's everything else too. Maybe the last question for you, Alexis, and it's a comment and question from a colleague and friend, Ruth Matthews, no relation to myself. Seem to be an inordinate number of Matthews running around the water world. And she says, how do we define resilience for whom? And as a public institution, that's kind of a special burden. I think that you're trying to, you're supposed to do it, maybe to take care of everybody, but you also have mentioned that resilience is a process. You have to also set priorities and think about those processes over time. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's actually a very, very, very interesting question. And I think that we do try to engage with our community, particularly in terms of, we had an opportunity with the massive retirement of our workforce and the difficulty to actually find a good workforce. We had an opportunity to engage with our community and do some, create some trainings, and so some apprenticeship to bring some of the people of our community, which are outside of, we would be considered part of the environmental justice or climate justice, and bring them in and provide them some income that way. So that's one way that we try to reach out. When we think about resilience actually to our system, the way that we look at it, at this point, it's been the metrics I have to recognize have been very focused on the infrastructure and how much water we can supply and in what conditions. We did explore, and I know that there's some really interesting work that way. We did explore how our transmission system, as it moves through the bay, which customers does it deliver, and in which neighborhood does it deliver? And so there's ways that we could think about for the future, and that's the next step for us. Think about if we have a big break in our system, if we have a big failure, who in this community is going to be mostly affected? Not only saying the name of the customer, but also being able to look at these customers as in terms of is it going to be poor neighborhoods or a rich neighborhood? What type of resilience do they have themselves? So that's next step for us.
Those are really important messages, I think for all of us to hear, and they really go to the heart of climate justice is also a set of actions and choices that we need to be able to make. I've been punished. I want to thank all the panelists for their participation. I've been asked, and this is my punishment, to be able to try and synthesize you somehow. It's one of my least favorite things to do. But one of the areas that I feel like is really emerging from this, and I'll put this in the context of the time that I've been working on water and climate issues, is that water resilience is becoming operational. It's becoming something that is not just something that a CEO, an executive director, that the president of a development bank or a mayor is talking about in very general terms. It's something that it is that people feel is important to their work at mid and lower levels of organizations, and that they need to actually and actively own water risk and water responsibility. And that's a change. That is a really significant change over time, and it's happening, I would say, remarkably quickly. Even 2 or 3 years ago, I feel like these issues were much quieter. And this one of the reasons why we in Agua were so interested in becoming a part of RAF is because we felt like it was a way to reach new audiences in this space. And one of the intriguing parts of RAF to me in that sense is that the document that we've released today is a common document across a wide range of audiences. And we recognize that there are differences as well. Eliza's comments about different types of indicators for different types of audiences is extremely apropos. But being able to move to that level, I think, is really important and critical. I'm going to turn now for our final comments to Jason Morrison. He is the president of the Pacific Institute and lead for the CEO Water Mandate. And he's going to be talking about next steps, where we see RAF heading into the future. The floor is yours, Jason. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, John, and thanks to the panelists and to the audience for the questions. It's been a terrific discussion, and I'm really actually inspired and excited about where this conversation is ending, but just for today, because I think where this work goes will warrant lots of further discussion. In order to talk about next steps, I thought I would try to maybe unpack a little bit about where we came from, going all the way back to Jed's comments about the genesis of this project. And also try to tie in the question that Eliza asked about how we think about resilience and water systems in the face of climate change and what's new. And when we started with this project, we really wanted to try to understand how we talk about water and how do we measure success in a way that can bring stakeholders together. Jed, if you recall, that was the initial ambition. And what we found in the early stages of that work, when it oriented around accounting, is that a lot of interests were entrenched in how they thought about key terms and concepts. But this opportunity to redefine the conversation because of climate change and its fundamental impact on water systems, we saw as an opportunity to organize a framework that could be relevant for all stakeholders to begin that conversation, understanding what are the stresses and shocks that the water system is facing. How many more of these 500-year floods are we going to get in a 5-year span or a 10-year span, or the wettest periods on record, or the driest or the hottest? And these are new ways that people are understanding the need to adapt our systems or to build resilience in our systems. And so, as each of the organizations on today's panel have talked about, we are entering a new phase and an ability, hopefully, to engage across stakeholders to get a shared understanding of what we're going to do together to build more water secure and resilient future. So John, I'm surprised you didn't use the idea of this, that you can't, even if you're a relatively well-resourced organization or entity in a basin, this notion of being the castle on the top of the hill that doesn't feel the negative impacts is probably not a great long-term strategy. And you need to think somehow more deeply about resilience, a concept that John had coined a while back in some written work. And so our thinking is the ability of the raft to bring stakeholders together to be able to engage on where that collective interest lies. Now, this general framework was meant to be relevant for all stakeholders. But what we know is needed is subsidiary guidance that would be applicable for stakeholders within the system. And as Kari mentioned, the 3 guidance documents we anticipate developing, one for corporates, one for utilities and urban planners, and they're already underway. We're looking for those to be finalized by January of next year. And we will embark in the pilot testing roughly starting at the end of Q1. By the end of Q1, we want to be able to identify where there's an opportunity to try to test these ideas in the real world. For the basin authorities, central planners, water ministries, that's a little bit on a lag. And that's because of capacity challenges, but also because we think how you think about the system will be informed by how we think about the key stakeholders within a system, understanding and managing for their own resilience. By Q2 of next year, we will have moved from this development phase to implementation and testing. And so if you're interested in working with us on either the development of these sector guidelines or in the testing of them in the real world, very much hope you'll reach out to us and that we can engage you in this process going forward. So thank you all for taking the time out of your day to be at this session versus the many great sessions at Stockholm World Water Week, and looking forward to engaging with you on this topic in the months to come. Thank you.
Thank you all. With that, we end the session, and you can get all the relevant information from the project website. Thank you.